Will come to order. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. We're here today to discuss the Congressional Budget Office's budget and economic outlook. And as always, the CBO has done a tremendous amount of difficult work to produce this report, and we appreciate their time and their input and their expertise. Additionally, I want to thank Director Elmendorf for testifying today and for his always diligent work. I know that we all look forward to hearing what he has to say today. In reviewing this report, one thing is abundantly clear. Our nation is on an unsustainable path. That's not just my characterization. The CBO itself notes that when we look at the long-term budget outlook, quote, debt would still be on an upward path relative to the size of the economy in 2039, a trend that would be ultimately unsustainable, unquote. Deficits are historically high right now, and they're projected to rise even more in 2017. And over the next decade, we're going to add $9.5 trillion more to the national debt. That means debt held by the public as a percentage of the economy will grow to 79% by the end of the decade and remain at these elevated levels. This is at the same time that the amount of revenue that will be coming into the government, that's the amount of tax revenue, will be at above the historic average. In other words, this is not a revenue problem. It's a spending problem. And for all that's been said about the recent decrease in annual deficits, which we welcome, we have not solved our nation's fiscal challenges. In fact, under the status quo, our fiscal and economic concerns only get worse. To quote from the summary, as it relates to the debt, quote, such large and growing federal debt would have serious negative consequences, including increasing federal spending for interest payments, restraining economic growth in the long term, giving policymakers less flexibility to respond to unexpected challenges, and eventually heightening the risk of a fiscal crisis, unquote. The projected increase in the debt will mean $5.6 trillion in interest payments alone over the next decade. In 2025, interest on the debt will top $800 billion in that year alone, which is no more than we spend right now on defense. It's more than we spend right now on the Departments of Transportation, Commerce, and Health and Human Services combined. That's just the interest. That's just the money that goes out the window and not being able to use for other national priorities. Meanwhile, Medicare and Social Security are continuing to slide further toward insolvency. Doing nothing about those programs is not an option. What we're talking about are the health and well-being of millions of Americans who count on these vital programs, not just for future generations, but current beneficiaries as well. So what does all of this fiscal turmoil mean for the future of our country? Simply put, if we stay on the same current course, less opportunity for American families and job creators. Economic growth will average just 2.3% annually over the next decade, below the historical average of 3.3%. That's unacceptable. Over the past several years, with each subsequent report, the Congressional Budget Office has continued to lower its projections for average gross domestic product growth. This, too, is unsustainable. And our job as policymakers is to listen to the families and the entrepreneurs and the job creators across this great country and do what we can to support a positive environment for job creation and economic growth. Right now, a lot of what's coming out of Washington with higher taxes and stifling regulations and an inefficient and ineffective federal bureaucracy is clearly not helping. And it's the middle class in particular that are losing out. For middle-class families, wages have stagnated and median income is down under current policies. So we can't stay on this path. It's unsustainable both for our budget and for working Americans. To change direction, we need to focus on policies that can produce real results, ideas that will save and strengthen health and retirement programs, balance the budget, and empower individuals and families and America's innovative workforce, not Washington bureaucrats. That's how we build the foundation for a healthy economy that will benefit every single American. So in the weeks and months ahead, here in the Budget Committee, I know that we will explore how we can achieve those goals, and I know that Director Elmendorf's testimony today will be an important part of that effort. I now wish to yield to the ranking member, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Van Hollen, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me start by congratulating you, Mr. Chairman, on your first hearing as Chairman of the Budget Committee. And to Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for your consistently good service to this committee, as well as your excellent service to our country. You are a great example of public service at its best. Let me just say that the jobs report that we saw last December had lots of good news, and a lot of that good news is reflected in the Congressional budget report that we're looking at today. Jobs grew last year at the fastest pace since 1999. Indeed, we've seen the fastest economic growth in over a decade. Our deficits have been cut by 2/3. The stock market has doubled, gas prices are down, and healthcare inflation is at its lowest rate at any time in the last 50 years. And in 2014, 10 million Americans will have the security of health coverage that they can afford. That's all good news. And the Congressional Budget Office has told us in previous hearings that a number of initiatives taken by the President and this Congress contributed to that good news, including the passage of the Recovery Act as well as other emergency economic measures that were taken. It is certainly a good thing that we did not pursue the advice of some, that we embark on an austerity program, that we deeply cut back at a time when the economy was struggling, that we adopt the measures that our European colleagues were taking. In fact, I recall many a time in this committee when our Republican colleagues were providing us with that kind of advice, including a report that was done by the Republican staff of the Joint Economic Committee that said we should follow the example of Europeans and just cut, cut, cut. Well, the reality is that as of today, since 2010, more jobs have been created in the United States than in Europe, Japan, and all advanced economies combined. Good thing we pursued a different course. And the American people know that we've seen lots of good news, and all the sort of talking down of the economy won't convince them otherwise. However, there is, as my colleague, Chairman Price indicated, one area where we've seen persistent, stubborn problems, and that is in the area of wage stagnation. This is not a new problem. I mean, if you look over a period of history, you've seen wage stagnation consistently dating way back to the late 1970s, where you saw growing labor productivity on the one hand, but relatively flat wages and frozen paychecks on the other hand. And I'm really pleased that the chairman is looking forward to focusing as a committee on that particular issue. And our Democrats on this committee welcome you, Mr. Chairman, in dealing with that, because the American people are working harder than ever, but they feel like they're on a treadmill, either falling behind or just running in place. And that's because despite the additional productivity, that productivity has not been translated into higher wages for the folks in the middle. If you look at where those productivity gains have gone, they've gone disproportionately to folks at the very, very high end of the income scale. And so we need to have a tax code. We need to have an economic strategy that provides for greater shared prosperity. And I look forward to working with our colleagues as we head into budget season to address that very important issue. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Elmendorf, thank you for your time today. We appreciate you joining us again. The committee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal record. You will have 8 minutes to deliver your opening remarks, and you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Van Hollen. My colleagues and I are very grateful for the support that you both have shown to our work for many years. And to you and to all the members of the committee, I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about CBO's outlook for the budget and the economy over the next 10 years. The federal budget deficit, which has fallen sharply during the past few years, is projected to hold steady relative to the size of the economy through 2018. Beyond that point, however, the gap between spending and revenues is projected to grow, further increasing federal debt relative to the size of the economy, which is already historically high. Those projections are based on the assumption that current laws governing taxes and spending will generally remain unchanged, and they are built upon our economic forecast. According to that forecast, the economy will expand at a solid pace in 2015 and for the next few years, to the point that the gap between the nation's output and its potential, that is, maximum sustainable output, will be essentially eliminated by the end of 2017. As a result, the unemployment rate will fall a little further, and more people will be encouraged to enter or stay in the labor force. Beyond 2017, we project, inflation-adjusted gross domestic product, or real GDP, will grow at a rate that is notably less than the average growth during the 1980s and 1990s. Let me address the budget outlook first, and then I will turn to the economic outlook. We estimate that the budget deficit for this fiscal year, 2015, will amount to $468 billion, slightly less than the deficit in 2014. At 2.6% of GDP, this year's deficit is projected to be the smallest relative to the nation's output since 2007, but close to the 2.7% the deficits have averaged over the past 50 years. Although the deficits in our baseline projection remain roughly stable as a percentage of GDP through 2018, as I noted, they rise after that. The deficit in 2025 is projected to be $1.1 trillion, or 4% of GDP. And cumulative deficits over the 2016 to 2025 period are projected to total $7.6 trillion. We expect that federal debt held by the public will amount to 74% of GDP at the end of this fiscal year, more than twice what it was at the end of 2007 and higher than in any year since 1950. By 2025, in our baseline projections, federal debt rises to nearly 79% of GDP. When CBO last issued long-term budget projections in the summer, we projected that under current law, debt would exceed 100% of GDP 25 years from now and would continue on an upward trajectory thereafter. That trend could not be sustained. Such large and growing federal debt would have serious negative consequences, including increasing federal spending for interest payments, restraining economic growth in the long term, giving policymakers less flexibility to respond to unexpected challenges, and eventually heightening the risk of a fiscal crisis. Why will deficits and debt increase relative to GDP under current law? In our projections, outlays rise from a little more than 20% of GDP this year, which is about what federal spending has averaged over the past 50 years, to a little more than 22% in 2025. Four key factors underlie that increase: the retirement of the baby boom generation, the expansion of federal subsidies for health insurance, rising healthcare costs per person, and rising interest rates on federal debt. Consequently, under current law, spending would grow faster than the economy for Social Security, for the major healthcare programs, including Medicare, Medicaid, and subsidies offered through insurance exchanges, and for net interest costs. In sharp contrast, though, mandatory spending apart from that for Social Security and healthcare, as well as both defense and non-defense discretionary spending, would shrink relative to the size of the economy. By 2019, outlays in those three categories taken together would fall below the percentage of GDP they were in 1998 through 2001, when such spending was the lowest since at least 1940, the earliest year for which comparable data have been reported. Revenues are projected to rise significantly by 2016, buoyed by the expiration of several provisions that reduce tax liabilities and by the ongoing economic expansion. In our projections, based on current law, revenues equal about 18.5% of GDP in 2016 and remain between 18 and 18.5% throughout the coming decade. Revenues at that level would represent a greater share of the economy than their 50-year average of about 17.5% of GDP, but would still be less than outlays by growing amounts over the course of the decade. Revenues from individual income taxes are expected to rise relative to GDP, mostly because people's incomes will move into higher tax brackets as their income gains outpace inflation, to which those brackets are indexed. But those increases are expected to be offset by reductions relative to GDP in revenues from the corporate income tax and from other sources. Turning from the budget to the economy, we anticipate that economic activity will expand at a solid pace in 2015 and the next few years, reducing the amount of underused resources, or slack, in the economy. In our estimation, increases in consumer spending, business investment, and residential investment will drive the economic expansion this year and over the next few years. The growth in those categories of spending will derive mainly from increases in hourly compensation for workers, from rising wealth, from the recent decline in oil prices, and from a step-up in the rate of household formation. As measured by the change from the fourth quarter of the previous year, real GDP will grow by about 3% in 2015 and 2016, and by 2.5% in 2017, we expect. The difference between actual GDP and our estimate of potential GDP, which is a measure of slack for the whole economy, was about 2% of potential GDP at the end of 2014. During the next few years, we expect, actual GDP will rise more rapidly than its potential, gradually eliminating that slack. For the labor market in particular, we anticipate that slack will dissipate by the end of 2017. By our projections, increased hiring will reduce the unemployment rate from 5.7% in the fourth quarter of last year to 5.3% in the fourth quarter of 2017, which is close to the expected natural rate of unemployment, meaning the rate arising from all sources other than fluctuations in the overall demand for goods and services. That increased hiring will also encourage more people to enter or stay in the labor force, boosting the labor force participation rate, which is just the percentage of people who are looking for work or are working. Our projections beyond the next few years are not based on estimates of cyclical developments in the economy, because we do not attempt to predict economic fluctuations that far into the future. Instead, those projections are based on estimates of underlying factors that affect the economy's productive capacity. For 2020 through 2025, we project that real GDP will grow by an average of 2.2% per year, a rate that matches our estimate of the potential growth of the economy in those years. Potential output is expected to grow much more slowly than it did during the 1980s and 1990s, primarily because the labor force is anticipated to expand more slowly than it did then. Growth in the potential labor force will be held down by the ongoing retirement of the baby boom generation, by a relatively stable labor force participation rate among working age women, after sharp increases from the 1960s to the mid-1990s, and by federal tax and spending policies set in current law. The elimination of slack in the economy will eventually remove the downward pressure on the rate of inflation and on interest rates that has existed in the past few years. By our estimates, the rate of inflation, as measured by the price index for personal consumption expenditures, will move up gradually to the Federal Reserve's goal of 2%, hitting that mark in 2017 and beyond. Interest rates on Treasury securities, which have been exceptionally low since the recession, will rise considerably over the next several years, we expect, but remain lower than they were on average in previous decades. Between 2020 and 2025, the projected interest rates on 3-month Treasury bills and 10-year Treasury notes are 3.4% and 4.6%, respectively. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Elmendorf. I appreciate the statement, and I want to pick up where you were just leaving off, and that is in the area of economic growth. If we could bring up slide number 1, please. Your report shows a decline in the long-term growth projections relative to last year. That's the correct slide there. And your baseline last year showed a similar decline in economic growth versus the baseline before that. In fact, what we've seen, and this has become a regular feature of CBO forecasts, each time that we get an update, you honestly and sincerely tell us that the economic growth will be even slower than you previously thought. And this is extremely concerning because a slowing economic growth means less opportunity and fewer jobs. In fact, my friend from Maryland, Mr. Van Hollen, talked about wage stagnation. Wage stagnation, we would suggest, is a byproduct of slow economic growth. So I wonder if you would please address, and you touched on it, but address the main factors behind this downward revision in your economic growth, and how does the lower growth projection impact our budget?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The principal reason why we think economic growth will be slower over the coming decade than it was in previous decades is, as I mentioned in my opening statement, slower growth of the labor force, primarily because of demographic trends. But federal fiscal policy will play some role as well. But we've known those things over the past several years. And the main reasons that we've revised down our projections of economic growth in this projection and in a number of previous ones, as the chairman notes, is because the performance of the economy during the past several years has been disappointing. And we have taken some signal from the elements of disappointment over the past few years for our projections for the future. In particular, for this forecast, we have observed that actual productivity growth has been a good deal weaker than we thought the potential productivity growth of the economy could be. And some gap between the actual productivity growth and the potential growth would be expected in a weaker economy because if businesses don't feel a strong demand for their goods and services, their workforces aren't generally pushed as hard. But there was a growing divergence between the path of productivity growth we thought the economy could be on and the path that it was on. And because the economy has been improving, that gap should have been narrowing, not widening. So we thought that we needed to take a signal from the weak observed productivity growth and bring down our projection of the productivity growth, the trend productivity growth, if you will, that the economy was going back to.
And the effect that has on our budget?
The widening, the reduction in GDP makes the budget outcome worse, principally because with lower GDP, that brings lower incomes, which brings lower tax revenues. Also, to some extent, lower incomes mean greater spending on certain government programs.
You also cite in your report, and I read it in my opening statement, that the large growing debt and the decreasing growth are a result of the kinds of things that you mentioned, but also a result of changes in policy, tax and spending policy, and slower growth in the labor force that you mentioned from baby boomers retiring, and the participation among women is stabilizing. But federal and tax spending policies, one of which you specifically cite as being the Affordable Care Act, would you please help us and explain the ACA's impact on longer-term growth and labor participation?
Yes. Our projections for the economy are based on the budget policies in current law, and our projections of the budget are based on our economic outlook. So the projections we've given you today are meant to be consistent with each other. And in this case, that means that we have taken on board the effects of changes in fiscal policy that are occurring under current law. And the two most important ones are the real bracket creep that I mentioned in my opening remarks, which is just that with tax brackets indexed primarily to inflation in the individual income tax, that rising after inflation incomes tend to push more income into higher tax brackets. That's one important factor. And the other important factor is the Affordable Care Act. We wrote a long analysis of this in our outlook 1 year ago, and we explained that based on our estimates, the Affordable Care Act's subsidies for lower income people, and to a lesser extent their taxes on higher income people, would reduce the amount of labor that workers would choose to supply. And for lower income people, you could think about this as a benefit is being provided that was not provided under prior law. That makes lower income people better off, and it means that as they raise their market income, those subsidies are withdrawn, and those factors provide a disincentive for them to work, and we think that some of them will work a little less hard. The combination of the real bracket creep and the Affordable Care Act is to reduce the labor force participation rate by something around 1 percentage point in 2025, according to our estimates.
In your previous estimate, you noted that it was the equivalent of 2 million FTEs.
Yes, that's right.
In 2017 and 2.5 in 2024, and you still stand by those numbers?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
If we could put up slide number 2, please. I want to shift to the issue of deficits, and there's been a lot of talk about the decreasing deficits, and although we applaud those, your current forecast predicts a deficit of $468 billion this year. Last year it was $483 billion. Your forecast shows, however, as the chart demonstrates, that deficits will once again exceed $1 trillion, $1 trillion, over $1 trillion in 2025. And over the next 10 years, the cumulative deficit will be $7.6 trillion. Now, some prominent economists, as well as some members of the other side of the aisle, have made the argument that deficits have come down from their historic highs and that the budget's now stable and that deficits no longer represent a threat. So, Dr. Elmendorf, I would like you to give your opinion as to whether or not deficits are no longer a threat, and do you believe that a $7.6 trillion cumulative deficit over 10 years is a responsible fiscal policy?
Well, as you know, Mr. Chairman, I don't provide judgments on adjectives and adverbs that other people use. But as we've said repeatedly over the last several years, federal debt relative to the size of the economy is now historically high, the highest it's been since 1950, higher than any period in our history except for that right around the end of the Second World War. And that high level of debt and the further increases in debt relative to the size of the economy that we project for later in this decade and beyond have significant costs and pose significant risks for the U.S. economy. And that's partly just the rise in interest payments that you noted yourself, Mr. Chairman. It is partly ultimately the crowding out of capital investment, which would then mean somewhat lower wages than would otherwise be the case, as a cost in the loss of flexibility that you and your colleagues would have to deal with future financial crises or recessions or international events. And there's a growing risk as debt rises of a fiscal crisis. Those costs are we think, significant ones. But the manner of your dealing with them is, of course, something we leave to you.
All of those things that you mentioned result in greater uncertainty in the economy and have contributed, obviously, to the decrease in the economic growth that we've seen in our country, and point to the necessity of getting our spending in order. And again, we're going to talk a lot about that and present what we believe are some solutions in our budget. Slide number 3, please. I want to shift a little bit now to the historic spending and revenue. Your report has states spending averaged about 20.1% of GDP over the past 50 years. What's your projection for spending in the current window?
So as that picture shows, Mr. Chairman, we expect under current law, federal outlays would rise relative to the size of the economy from where they are now, which is quite close to the historical average, by about 2 more percentage points.
And on the revenue side, on the tax collection side, you predict that we will collect more tax as a share of revenue than our 50-year historical average, correct?
That's right, Mr. Chairman. Now, as you understand, the outlays are rising relative to the size of the economy because of factors that are at work now that have not been at work so much in the past. So the number of people receiving Social Security benefits will rise by 18 million over the coming decade. Because the baby boomers are now moving into retirement. So there are some underlying forces pushing up spending that the country has not really had to deal with before, but does need to deal with now, either by changing those programs or by raising additional revenues or through some combination.
Sometimes folks look at the increased revenue and the record revenue that we received in the fourth quarter, as a matter of fact, in absolute dollars, and they say that we're receiving enough money to run the government. In fact, the outlays, the spending is increasing at an even greater rate. Consequently, the increase in the deficit, and as we talked about, that's what drives the removal of monies, revenues, resources from American families, hard-working taxpayers, to be able to utilize for the things that they believe to be most important and to realize their dreams. So we will concentrate on those things as we move forward. Thank you very much. I now yield to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony, Dr. Elmendorf. In your answer to the first question by the chairman, he asked you, what was the major factor in terms of slower growth in the out years? And you said there were a combination of factors, but a major factor was the change in demographics, right?
Yes.
Now, last year you had the opportunity to score the impact on long-term growth of an immigration bill. In fact, a bipartisan immigration bill that passed the Senate. And your determination was, CBO's determination was that actually would boost economic growth in the out years, was it not?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
And in fact, you estimated that legislation would increase GDP by 5.4% in 2033 and 3.3% in 2023. Is that correct?
That sounds right to me, Congressman, yes.
And that's obviously a piece of legislation aimed directly at the problem that you addressed, which is changing demographics in a way that would boost economic growth, right?
Yes, Congressman.
Now, the chairman referenced a couple times the deficit issue in the out years, which is a significant concern. Last year, this House passed a series of corporate tax breaks, permanent extensions of things like the R&D tax credit and some other measures. Do you recall that?
Yes, Congressman.
And CBO did scores on those measures, did they not?
Well, so the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation provided a revenue estimate, and we used their numbers in our official cost estimate for legislation. That's
right. And by adding all those up, which we have, it looks like if you include debt service, you're talking about $950 billion in additions to the deficit. Is that correct?
Yes, Congressman, that's right.
So that's another $950 billion on the deficit in addition to the projections in your current report, right?
Included in the projections in our current, oh, I'm sorry, you mean the ones that were?
Yeah, these are the increases in terms.
Yes, the other ones, right, those would be in addition. Those would be in
Yeah.
addition to what's in our report,
Right.
yes, Congressman.
Which would increase the deficit even further beyond your report, correct?
Yes, Congressman.
Right, which would slow long-term economic growth, correct?
We've not done a full economic analysis, but certainly that increase in deficits would be something that would slow economic growth. But the changes in tax provisions might have other economic effects, and we've not estimated those.
But just to be clear, when you added, for example, last year, your so-called bonus deficit reduction to the Republican budget, you did that simply based on the reduced out-year deficit, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
And so, by similar logic, if you increase the deficit by close to $1 trillion, you will reduce economic growth according to those calculations, right?
That increase in the deficit, leaving other factors aside, would reduce economic output later in the decade. Yes, Congressman.
Thank you. Now, the Republican budget also eliminates the revenues generated from the Affordable Care Act, which by last count, CBO did range to over $1 trillion. Is that right?
That was our last estimate of those revenues. Yes, Congressman.
And so it also follows that if those revenues are not somehow replaced, you would add $1 trillion to the deficit by repealing them, right?
Again, leaving aside any incentive effects of the changes, of the specific changes in tax provisions, but just looking at the effects on the deficit alone, yes, reductions in tax revenue that increase the deficit would, through that deficit channel, lower future economic output.
Right. So, and again, when you tell the committee that a certain amount of long-term deficit reduction will add a certain amount of economic growth, those calculations are based on deficit reduction gained either by cuts or by revenue or a combination of cuts and revenue. Isn't that right?
Yes, Congressman. When we analyze the effects of changes in fiscal policies on the economy, we try to capture a number of channels. One is the effects of the deficit, the amount of borrowing that the federal government does. Another is the incentive effects of changes in tax rates. Another is the incentive effects of transfer programs. And the fourth is changes in government investments. So we try to analyze all four of those channels, but in some cases where all that we are given is a different path for deficits, then we will provide an analysis to the Congress of the effects of that different deficit path.
Right. No, I think it's worth noting that a major piece of legislation that was before this Congress last year, the bipartisan comprehensive immigration bill, would have significantly dealt with the first issue you raised, which was the demographics, and the two pieces of legislation, namely, getting rid of a lot of the, corporate tax, extending corporate tax cuts without having them offset, and getting rid of the Affordable Care Act revenues, that those would significantly add to the deficit and reduce long-term economic growth. I'd like to ask you a couple questions regarding this debate over so-called dynamic scoring, just so we understand what the implications are.
Yes.
And what the limitations are with respect to current models that are used by Joint Tax and the Congressional Budget Office. First, there have been a number of recent studies, including those from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Standards and Poor's, and the IMF, that suggest that increased income inequality can have a negative impact on overall economic growth. Is that connection between growing income inequality and reduced economic growth taken into account in the models that CBO uses to conduct macroeconomic analysis today?
It is incorporated in our baseline projections, but in the analysis that we do of the effects of policy proposals, we do not capture any effect of changes in inequality on future growth.
Do you believe that that link is something that deserves greater attention as you refine your microeconomic analysis and estimating process?
Yes, I think it does, Congressman. We're of course, aware of those studies. It would be crucially important if we were to incorporate such an effect in our modeling to understand the causal connections, to understand what it is about inequality that seems to have this effect on growth. For example, is it inequality per se, or is it low wage and income growth among low-income people, or is it a lack of economic mobility? Is it through policy channels, or is it through other channels? So we would need to understand better how this effect works. And for this, as for other things that we include in our models, we will be trying to draw on the research by other people. And I think in some areas the research literature is more comprehensive than others. But we will look into this issue, Congressman.
But just to be clear, that is not currently incorporated into your models, right?
That's correct, Congressman.
Now, one thing that is in the models that you and the Joint Tax Committee use is something called the overlapping generations or life cycle model. Is that correct?
That is one of our models, yes, Congressman.
And as you're aware, that model requires an assumption that the federal budget deficit will be stabilized or eliminated in order for the models to work and produce a result. Is that correct?
Yes, if a policy that we're analyzing would cause budget deficits to rise indefinitely, then because the people in the model are trying to look forward themselves, we need to give them a feasible path of fiscal policy to look forward to, and that means putting something else into the model that would bring down those rising deficits.
So, for example, when Mr. Camp had his tax reform proposal last year, one of the models applied was this model, correct?
That's right. As you know, this is analysis by JCT, and I don't want to speak too much for what they've done, but yes, this was one of the models.
Essentially, even though that tax reform proposal did not have any policies in it that would have reduced the out-year deficits generated by the tax portions of his policy, that model assumed somehow that those reductions in those cuts would be made, correct?
I believe that JCT staff built those into their estimates, Congressman, but I don't know the details of that.
I mean, do you think that approach is a reasonable calculation of how the real world would react?
Well, as you know, Congressman, these are models. They're not reality. And we use two different models, and we use a range of parameters, specific values in these models, to try to capture the uncertainty that economists have about how the real world reacts. We are very sensitive to trying not to have our own judgments about future policies affect our results in any significant way. Our job is to analyze the policies that you and your colleagues bring to us.
Right, but that model...
It's a weakness of this model, and for our perspective, that it requires some assumption to be made about future fiscal policy. And we, in fact, focus on our other model in most of the work that we do. But I don't want to rule out the use of this model because it does capture some aspects of behavior the other model does not.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have if I could just ask Dr. Elmendorf, I have another series of questions on the dynamic scoring. If I could ask that I submit all members' questions in writing and that provide us an answer.
Absolutely. All members may be able to submit questions for the record and to Dr. Elmendorf. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Rakita, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Good morning, Dr. Elmendorf. Good to have you back.
Good morning, Congressman. Good to see you again.
I want to pick up on the revenue side of the discussion and one of your phrases, which is classic at this point, and I want to see exactly how true it is, and that is we can get ourselves out of this deficit and then the debt load that we're carrying now and in the future by either raising revenues, reducing spending, or a combination of both. To the revenue part of that, really? We can erase all of this and what you're thinking is going to come in the future in terms of our debt load just by raising revenue?
Well, so I think yes, Congressman, is the answer to that question.
What does that look like?
We showed in our long-term budget outlook last summer a number of alternative paths for fiscal policy. We took an extension of current law. We looked at some other scenarios as well. And we looked at scenarios that had a $2 trillion reduction in deficits over the first decade and then extended that, and a scenario that had a $4 trillion reduction in deficits over the first decade and extended that. And roughly speaking, the $2 trillion in reduction was sufficient to keep the debt from rising as a share of GDP over the next 25 years. And the $4 trillion in deficit reduction over the decade, then extended, was enough to push debt relative to GDP on a downward path. So if the Congress chose to raise revenues by $4 trillion over the coming decade, depending on the specifics of how that was done, because some ways of raising revenues would, of course, have negative economic consequences themselves, and we'd have to model that.
But you haven't modeled that particular part of it, right? The negative.
No, we would need to get a specific set of tax changes from you. We didn't in this long-term budget outlook because we didn't want to be in the position of picking particular policies. We were illustrating the deficit effects.
Thank you. My question went more to the, what we're seeing is $100 trillion and sort of numbers like that that are, a generation off in the future, 25 years or so. And I don't know that the revenue remedy would be able to solve that at 2.3% GDP, as you indicated as our average.
So, as you know, we don't put a lot of weight ourselves on our projections beyond the next 25 years, recognizing the uncertainty that our projections for the next year or 5 or 10 or 25 years have in them already.
Do you think?
But I think, Congressman, part of the way you get to very large nominal dollars of debt in future years is a compounding of interest because of a compounding of debt. And this illustrates the crucial point that the sooner that action is taken to put debt on a different, to adjust spending or revenues, to put deficits and debt on a different trajectory, then the less dramatic that action would need to be. Because the longer one waits and the more debt accumulates, then the larger are the ongoing interest payments that need to be dealt with.
Understood. Thank you. I want to switch to federal credit programs, and a note in the report, and I think you said it was said as late as yesterday that the current scoring method known as the FCRA does not consider all costs borne by the government. Now, the President has proposed changing the terms of the student loan repayment program to a pay-as-you-earn kind of model. What would be the effect of this?
I don't know if we've
Taxpayers.
studied that plan specifically, Congressman. If this is part of the President's new budget submission, well, then we will analyze that after the budget is released next week. We don't analyze in response to the statements that have been made. We wait for the budget documents to arrive, and we'll provide a full analysis that we'll do together with our colleagues on the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation
What did you
in
mean
March.
then by the not considering all the costs borne by the government?
So the FCRA, or FCRA, as people sometimes call it, is the Federal Credit Reform Act. It was enacted in 1990, and it was as widely viewed as a tremendous advance in how the federal government accounts for credit programs, because it accounts for the cost of loans that are issued or loans that are guaranteed on an accrual basis. It looks ahead to the expected payments related to that loan and records them in the budget at the time that the commitment is made by the federal government. But what FCRA requires us to do by law is to discount the future flows to and from the government using Treasury borrowing rates. That procedure allows for the expected defaults, the expected losses on loans, but it does not account for the cost of the uncertainty of the risk.
Would fair value accounting be a better method?
And in our judgment, Congressman, what's called fair value accounting, which involves discounting at a private market interest rate, would better account for the cost of the risk that the government bears.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Yarmouth is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Dr. Elmendorf. Nice to see you again. I'm going to ask some questions and make some comments that probably will sound critical, and I want to make sure you know I'm not being critical of CBO. I'm not being critical of you or anyone else. I'm trying to get at a point that should become self-evident. We've heard now for years when Chairman Ryan was in this committee and again today about long-term deficits going to 2070 and so forth. And I remember a couple of years ago when Secretary Geithner, Treasury Secretary Geithner was here, and I asked the question of how reliable those estimates were looking out 40, 50 years, and he said they're not reliable at all. He said, as a matter of fact, I think anything over 5 years is not particularly reliable. So I appreciate your comment about the 25 years, and now we're going to focus on the shorter term. Your agency yesterday, your department, issued a revised estimate of the cost of the Affordable Care Act, saying it would cost 20% less over the next 5 years than previously estimated. And that is actually a $139 billion difference over those 5 years, from roughly 710 to 571 billion, I think, were the numbers. that's an awful lot of money. And when we're dealing with issues like PAYGO, from Democrats' perspective, that's a lot of human investment that we could either avoid cutting or making. And maybe on the Republican preference, that's a lot of tax cuts that would be available, or deficit reduction that would be available. So I want to get at some of the kind of the estimates. Now, you've projected, again, a deficit of $468 billion for the coming fiscal year. A year ago, what was the estimate of that deficit? Do you know?
I'm not sure, Congressman. In the summer, we were very close. A year ago, I'm not sure, I'm afraid.
And last year it was $483 billion. Do you remember what the estimate of that was back in 2013?
I'm sorry, I don't, Congressman.
Okay,
But I take your general point.
Yes, does CBO keep score of the estimates and report on that? Because obviously, if you're dealing with margins of error of 20% or more or less, that calls into question, again, the usefulness of the estimates, not necessarily the methodology. That's a whole other issue as far as I'm concerned. Because when we're relating it to PAYGO rules that we have, that's an incredibly important difference. And so I guess my comment or my question is, if we're looking at an environment in which we do dynamic scoring, does dynamic scoring, understanding dynamic scoring is not related to every piece of legislation, just a certain category of legislation. But in general, does dynamic scoring, because of the vast number of variables out there, make it more or less difficult to come up with something that's useful, cost projections, or does it actually increase the margin of error on those estimates, in your opinion?
Yes. So, Congressman, my colleagues and I are really not offended by your pointing out the limitations of the work that we do. Making budget and economic projections is an extremely challenging task, and we do our very best, and we draw on our own knowledge, of course, but also on the best knowledge that we can obtain from people outside of CBO. Nonetheless, our projections are fraught with errors, and we readily acknowledge that. We do report in every one of our new budget and economic projections the sources of the revisions from the previous set of projections. We did that again this time. And some of the revisions come because you and your colleagues have passed legislation, but others come because we've misjudged the economy or we've misjudged technical factors affecting particular programs. And the uncertainty around our projections is quite large. We actually will be releasing within a week or two another of our regular analyses of the accuracy of our economic forecasts. And the good news is that we are at least as good as other leading forecasters, and the bad news is that leading forecasters aren't very good. We will be following that up in maybe a month or two with an analysis that's well underway of the accuracy of our revenue forecasts, and we intend to follow that at some later point with an analysis of the accuracy of our overall budget projections.
Great.
So we try to be honest with you and your colleagues about the uncertainties. As regarding the dynamic estimates, trying to judge the macroeconomic effects of pieces of legislation is very difficult and is very uncertain. And we try to show that by often including ranges of estimates when we present that kind of analysis to you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. McClintock for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, I am sympathetic to you in this line of questioning. I think it was Yogi Berra who said that predictions are very difficult, especially when they involve the future. It's even difficult sometimes to predict the present. I was taken by the ranking member's opening statement that the economy is doing so much better because we're spending like drunken sailors, and not exactly his words, but certainly the sentiment of everything's going great. Just as he was making that statement, at that instant, the AP issued a flash report that the Dow is down 350 points this morning, quote, after weak earnings and economic reports. So it's even difficult sometimes to predict the present. But
Absolutely.
The past is much easier to predict and offers us guidance and lessons for the future. So let me ask you this. How does this recovery compare to the Reagan recovery when Reagan was cutting federal spending by 2% of GDP?
Well, Congressman, I don't have that recovery at hand, but we wrote a report a few years ago that compared to this recovery to the average of previous previous half dozen or so recoveries. And GDP has increased much more slowly in this recovery than it did in
So
preceding
we
ones.
increased spending dramatically in this recovery, and the recovery is going much slower. Reagan cut spending by 2% of GDP. The recovery was much better in comparison. Let me ask you about the Clinton years. How does this recovery compare to the Clinton years when Clinton was cutting federal spending by 4% of GDP?
Again, Congressman, I don't know have the numbers at hand for specific previous recoveries, although we can find those for you. But as you understand, you are picking particular factors that can affect the strength of economic growth. But there are a lot of factors that affect economic growth. And one thing that we've written very clearly about that's affected growth over the past half dozen years is the different demographic situation in this country relative to the demographic situation in the 1980s and 1990s.
Exactly, and I'd like to get to that in a few minutes if we could, but first if I could turn for a moment to Social Security, which is, we're told, in a permanent state of deficit. How does that permanent state of deficit impact debt held by the public?
Well, Congressman, at this point, and we show this in, as you were aware, but just so other people understand, in an appendix to the Budget and Economic Outlook, we show the projections for the trust fund, large trust funds, and we show that for the old age and survivors insurance trust fund, that expenditures are larger now than non-interest income. So apart from the interest payments that are being made from the Treasury to the trust fund on the debt the trust fund already has, just, if you will, the payroll tax revenues are less than the cost of benefits in OASI, and that's also true in the DI program.
As that deficit is addressed, does that not increase the amount of
Yes.
debt held by the public?
And the gap between the non-interest income and the spending from both OASI and DI increase the size of the deficit and
that
therefore
will-
require more borrowing from the public.
And that will continue until the loan that the Social Security made to the federal Treasury is redeemed, and at that point, then we have an across-the-board cut in benefits. Is that correct?
So when the trust funds run out of money, which we think they will do under current law, then yes, then no other changes made, benefits would have to be cut.
Let me ask you this. Will today's, if we continue down the path we're on, can today's college students count on receiving the Social Security benefits that they've been promised?
No, Congressman.
Okay, how about their parents? How about the person who's just turning 40 this year, who will turn 65 in 2040? Can that person count on receiving the Social Security benefits that they've been promised all their lives?
So, Congressman, in our last long-term projections from last summer, we projected that the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund would run out of money in 2032. The Disability Insurance Trust Fund, we think, will run out of money in fiscal year 2017.
2032. So the person turning 45 years old today should plan on not getting the Social Security benefits that they've been promised, but rather a much reduced amount.
Unless additional money is put into the Social Security Trust Fund, then the benefits that are written in current law cannot be provided beyond that point by our estimates.
All right. Let me ask you this. Is time our ally in this? Can we wait this thing out? Or do the measures we have to take become more and more dramatic as that calendar marches on?
The longer that the country waits until changes are made, then the sharper those changes, the more dramatic those changes will need to be.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Pocan from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Dr. Elmendorf. Thank you for being back here. Let me try a couple different areas, if I can, in the time I have. One, our federal spending that helps to stimulate the economy for economic growth, education, research and development, infrastructure. In looking at the level of discretionary spending, if I understand it right, we're probably at a lower share between our defense and non-defense programs and discretionary spending than any year since 1962, and that we're well below our average in the last 40 years. What kind of a outlook can we look for? Can you expand on that with federal spending for those areas, and also what could that mean for economic growth?
Yes, Congressman. So federal spending can stimulate economic growth in two ways. One is that in the short term, under the conditions we've had in this country for the last half dozen years, the extra spending provides a boost to the demand for goods and services, and that encourages firms to hire more workers. That's why we've estimated, and the vast majority of economists agree, that the Recovery Act boosted output and employment relative to what otherwise would have happened. The other way in which government spending can, in some cases, stimulate economic growth is if the government is making investments in physical infrastructure, in the labor force through education and training, or in technology through support for research and development. If the investments are made there that are effective investments, then that can boost economic growth over the long term. And our modeling tries to account for that effect. We wrote a report a couple of years ago about the historical patterns of federal investment. Federal investment has represented, in the three categories I described together, about half of non-defense discretionary spending over time. And if that share is maintained over the next decade, and if total non-defense discretionary funding follows the path set under the current caps, then those federal investments will become smaller relative to the size of the economy than they've been since 1960, at least 1962, which is the first year for which we have data on discretionary spending.
So despite the fact that we've had, 58 consecutive months of job growth, last year, our best year since 1999, we could be shrinking that because of the levels of discretionary spending that are going to be available unless we do something differently.
You could be, Congressman. Again, it depends exactly how those appropriations pan out. Yes.
Sure. A question on the tax revenue portion, the corporate tax revenue portion. It looks like it's going down in your projections, somewhat because of inversions. Can you talk a little bit about why that's going down?
Yes. So so we do project that corporate tax revenues will fall relative to GDP over time. One factor is we think that profits will fall as a share of GDP. That is partly because interest rates, we think, will rise, and that raises corporate interest payments, which are a cost, and partly because we think that labor compensation will grow more rapidly, so that workers will get a larger share of output, and corporate profits will become a smaller share. So we think that corporate profits will decline as a share of GDP. But on top of that, there are a number of factors that we think will tend to hold down tax revenues, corporate tax revenues relative to corporate profits. And two that we highlight are, one, efforts by companies to move business income out of the corporate form to a non-corporate form, so out of a form that's taxed under they're called C corporations, move them to S corporations or partnerships or things of that sort. Another factor we talk about is efforts by companies to have more of their profits reported to be earned overseas, where they're much less subject to U.S. taxes. And one of the ways in which companies can move reported profits overseas, not the only way, but one way, is through corporate inversions. And we think that this collection of factors, the ongoing movement from C to S corporations and the attempt to move more income to foreign countries, we think those factors together will reduce tax revenues from the corporate sector by about 5% by 2025 relative to 2015.
And in the remaining 50 seconds, if I can, real quickly, we've had this economic growth that's been happening. The question is, wages have been relatively stagnant, especially for folks in the middle class. Can you just address that in the 41 seconds remaining?
Yes. So we have been surprised, as many forecasters have been surprised, by how low the labor share of income has fallen. The share of total national income going to labor as opposed to capital had been fairly steady for a number of years, but now it's been falling for 15 years, really. And some of that is natural in a weak economy, but it's gone beyond that point. And we think that as the economy strengthens, as businesses need more workers, and as the pool of available workers is soaked up, then businesses will have to start offering higher wages to lure workers to come to work for them. So we think compensation growth will pick up, but not to the point where the share of income going to labor gets back as high as it was for most years before 2000. And we think that's because of structural changes in the economy. But we do think that labor compensation will grow more rapidly as the demand for workers increases. And with the fact that labor compensation growth has not picked up very much at all yet is a strong signal that there's still a good deal of slack in the labor market, which means unemployed workers and people out of the labor force who can be drawn back in if firms want them.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Elmendorf. Always interesting and enlightening to hear from you. I learn every time I listen to you speak. Thank you for what you do for our country and our Congress. I'd like to have Dr. Price's slide of GDP growth up, if I could get that up. Okay, 2 years ago, you said GDP growth you thought would be 2.9%, then 2.5%, then 2.1% now. And you said that in your statement that GDP growth would be restricted in the future because of demographics. The reason you show this going down now is because of disappointing performance in recent history. Is that right?
Yes, the demographic changes we were well aware of half a dozen years ago. What we were not aware of was how weak productivity growth would be. That's the biggest factor for accounting for the revision from last year to this year.
What do you think is restraining productivity growth? Now that we're looking historically, what do you think is restraining it?
We mumble a bit about that in the report, Congressman, and we mumble for good reason because we don't actually know the answer. Probably part of it is the recession itself, and part is other factors.
I'll have to interrupt
Yes.
you. What is the average GDP growth over the last 20 years? Do you know, 20, 30, 40? Can you give me?
I don't know offhand, Congressman.
Okay, can you,
I mean,
any estimate?
well, so
Isn't 2.9 below average, and now at 2.1, we're way below average?
We're certainly well below average, Congressman. So there's a table in our report that shows growth over past decades, and growth in the 1980s and 1990s was around 3%, over 3%, 3.25% of GDP. We're projecting growth at about 2.25% of GDP. So that's a percentage point below the.
All right. So if we had that additional percentage point, how would that affect our budget deficit projection?
That would be a hugely beneficial thing for the budget, Congressman.
All right. Now let me ask you this. Do higher taxes, you mentioned inversions. So we've got companies that are moving overseas because our tax system is uncompetitive, right?
Because they have tax advantages overseas, yes.
Okay, so if we have an uncompetitive tax system, does that restrain GDP? I mean, we see it doing it, right? They're moving jobs overseas, right?
I think it does restrain
Okay,
GDP,
thank you,
Congressman,
sir.
but
Thank you.
the specifics of a different tax system would matter a lot for the effects
Right.
it would have on GDP.
We need a competitive tax system. Do you think that if the government becomes larger and more intrusive and restrains employers through higher regulation, does that restrain GDP?
Congressman, I think it depends on the nature of the regulations. I don't want to issue broad comments.
Okay, but if the government, you don't agree with me that if the government restrains what employers can do and how they can do it and perform their business, that doesn't restrain the growth of GDP?
I think it depends on the nature of the restraints,
All right,
of the
do you
regulations.
think that if access to capital is more limited to employers, therefore they can't expand or borrow or whatever through additional banking regulation, and particularly community banks, does that restrain GDP?
I think all else equal, less access to capital restrains GDP. But whether all else is equal for current financial regulations, we haven't studied, Congressman.
Thank you, sir. And then on the on energy costs, we see that energy costs have come down despite the best efforts of the administration. And you say that helps. That's helped in this current forecast in the growth of GDP. So the converse of that, do higher energy costs negatively affect GDP?
Yes, Congressman.
Okay, thank you. And then does the federal debt growing from 70% of GDP and rising, does that restrain GDP growth?
Yes, Congressman. Again, all else equal.
So we've got higher taxes under this administration repeatedly. We've got an enormous growth in federal regulation. We've got higher energy costs. We've got a more intrusive government and restrictions on lending. And we've got GDP or federal debt at 70%, which is historically high and growing. Should we really have been surprised at weak GDP growth over the last 2 years? I mean, don't these factors all very clearly, wouldn't they all point to exactly what we've seen here, dropping from 2.9% to 2.5% to 2.3%?
Well, Congressman, we took on board our best assessment of all of the factors regarding federal policy and the rest of the economy here and around the world in the projections we made 2 years ago, and we've revised them now. So it's not that those factors are things that we're unaware of, but productivity growth has nonetheless been disappointing to us and I think to a large a number of other analysts.
And I have deep respect for you, sir, and I understand what you're saying, but disappointing, but maybe not surprising.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman
Thank you.
from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to touch base on the participation rate. You had mentioned it would be lower due to the changes of demographics, particularly with baby boomers retiring and stabilization of working women. But you mentioned about disincentives that keep people participating in the workforce. Well, wouldn't that have been reflected in the unemployment rate? Could you touch base how those seem to contradict each other?
So the unemployment rate reflects people who are looking for work but can't find jobs.
Right.
The labor force participation rate says how many people are are in a job or are looking to be in a job. So the participation rate mostly reflects the decisions by individuals to try to join the labor force. So if people decide not to look for a job because they don't think one would be available, which we think has happened a fair bit over the past few years, then that would bring down the labor force participation rate, but it wouldn't affect the unemployment rate, because the unemployment rate is expressed as a share of people who are looking for work. How many can't get it?
They
So
fall
if you-
off the rolls of the unemployed.
Fall off the rolls of the unemployed, but you would see them in a lower rate of labor force participation. And there's a similar point about the effects of policies. Policies that reduce people's incentives to work would be seen generally as a reduction in the labor force participation rate. People would just not turn up looking for a job. It wouldn't be seen necessarily in a change in the unemployment rate. There are some policies that can affect the unemployment rate as well, but those are different.
Certainly. You had just mentioned that there were structural changes that prevent wage stagnation from changing. Expand on that. So what structural changes would prevent from the middle class wages increasing, which we've seen a 15-year decline?
So one of the elements that we discuss in our report is greater globalization, and the fact that more goods and services can be made overseas and delivered here more cheaply and easily than in the past. And that's a factor that we and other analysts think has probably held down wages relative to what would have happened otherwise. Wages are still generally rising, but not as rapidly as they otherwise would. But I think the truth is the economics profession doesn't have a very crisp, clear answer to all. I mean, there are speculations and there's a lot of work being done, but we don't have anything that's close to a quantitative decomposition of why wage growth in recent years has been lower than it was in preceding decades.
But when NAFTA first came around, isn't there enough time to analyze what happened to the job growth in America after NAFTA was enacted?
I think there's been research on that question, Congressman, but I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with its findings. And we should recognize that in general, trade agreements can be good for the economy as a whole while still being bad for particular people in the economy, or they could be bad for the economy as a whole too, I think. So there are different combinations, but it really does depend on the nature of the trade agreement. And then we'd have to look carefully, not just at the people who seem most directly affected, but also at everyone else who might benefit, in some cases, from trade agreements because they can buy goods or services more cheaply. So this kind of analysis is not straightforward, even if it's very clear that some people who can be identified are worse off. That doesn't mean that that's the case for wage growth, real wage growth in general.
But when we look over the last 15 years, when most of our trade agreements have gone into effect, you've seen a 15-year decline of wages of that middle class. Isn't that correct?
We just haven't studied the connection between those events, Congressman. And then,
Well, that's a structural change that certainly would be in effect. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Black, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Elmendorf, I want to refer to in the report on page 17, figure 1.3, because I think this figure clearly shows us from your projections that the cost of these federal programs are growing faster than our economy can pay for them. And you project here in this that 84% of the growth in spending over the next decade will be due to three things: interest on our debt, which continues to grow. The more debt, the more interest that we pay, obviously. Our Social Security, and then also the health care programs that includes Medicare and also the health care subsidies that are in Obamacare. So in fact, both Social Security and Medicare will each nearly double in their size over this period. So is mandatory or what we call autopilot spending interest on our debt threatening to crowd out the funding for some of our other important investments or priorities such as education and infrastructure? Can you talk to what the effect of this chart, obviously, is having on other things that we'd like to be doing?
Yes, Congresswoman. You have it, I think, just right, that there are a handful of large programs that will get substantially larger over the next decade because of both more people going into them and, for the healthcare programs in particular, rising cost per person. At the same time, Congress has put caps on discretionary funding, which covers obviously Defense Department's work, but also almost all of what's considered investment by the federal government in education and so on, as you said. And those caps on the discretionary funding are going to push discretionary spending down to extremely low levels relative to the size of the economy compared with our history of the last 50 years. So there's a very striking shift underway under current law from the kinds of investments and other spending that you mentioned toward this handful of large programs that we highlight and you highlight.
So that would indicate that the longer we wait to do something in these programs, the more significant that will be in our other priorities that we have. And so that makes a really good case for looking at these programs and making sure that we now begin to get serious about reforming these programs. As a matter of fact, I want to go to the Social Security Disability Insurance Program in particular here, where we know that if Disability Insurance Trust Fund becomes insolvent, and we see that as a projection that it will become insolvent in just another 2 years. How will this affect the disabled workers that are in these programs?
Yes, Congresswoman, we project that the Disability Insurance Trust Fund will run out of money early in fiscal year 2017, which is to say late in the next calendar year or the beginning of the calendar year thereafter. And at that point, unless no more funds are provided or some other change is made, benefits will have to fall, but I think on the order of 20% or so. We wrote a report for the Congress in 2010 and another that discussed the trends that were pushing up enrollment and the cost of the disability insurance program, and then we followed with a report in 2012 of policy options that you and your colleagues could consider, and we have further work along these lines underway now. So we've tried to give you and your colleagues some sense of what options you have.
As a matter of fact, I've heard some folks just talk about if this trust fund does become defunct, that we would just then transfer money from the Old Age Survivor Fund into the Social Security Disability Fund. And can you tell me how that would affect both of these funds over long term?
So the approach you've described, Congresswoman, has been used before, as you know. If money is moved from the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund into the Disability Insurance Trust Fund, that will extend the number of years to which the DI Trust Fund can pay benefits, and it will reduce the number of years for which the OASI Trust Fund can pay benefits.
So that old acronym of robbing Peter to pay Paul is certainly the case here. And if something is not done to reform both of these programs, that will be all that we're doing is robbing Peter to pay Paul until essentially there's nothing left on either program to rob or pay.
Certainly, Congresswoman, if you want to help both programs, you're not going to accomplish that by moving money around just between them.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
The lady yields back. The gentleman from Washington State, Dr. McDermott, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the last 20 years, the Republicans have been in charge for 16, the Democrats for 4. This problem of the trust fund with respect to Social Security has not changed much in the 20 years. I sat on this committee back in the 90s, so I know what was going on then. Let's suppose we raised the cap, made all of us on this committee pay Social Security benefits beyond the 109 or 112 or 14, whatever it is right now, and paid it up at 250 or 300,000. Could we fill the gap in the trust fund?
Congressman, that change would make a substantial improvement in the Social Security Trust Fund. I don't know offhand how large an improvement. We have, as for DI, provided the Congress with a set of options for addressing the coming exhaustion of the Social Security, the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund. And we've looked at the effects of a range of alternative policies on the trust fund and on beneficiaries at different income levels and born in different cohorts, but I don't know those numbers offhand, I'm afraid.
I would appreciate it if you would give us, by a return mail or something, some of the options if we raise the trust fund to 400,000 or 500 or someplace, the cap. Because it seems to me that we've been talking about this, but nobody really wants to do anything about it. I think there are things we can do to make it absolutely certain they'll be there for the kids in the future.
We'll send that to you, Congressman.
I want to raise another issue, though, and that's student debt. Presently, student debt's at $1 trillion. Over the last further years, the cost of college has gone up by 1,000%. 70% of the graduates from the universities are a four-year degree have an average debt of at least $25,000. 1 in 10 borrowers owes more than $54,000, according to the figures. We're really saddling the generation after us with tremendous debt, and in my view, that's unacceptable. Now, Mike, the Federal Reserve has said in New York that the 30-year-old with a student debt is less likely to own a home than a similarly situated person without student debt. A 25-year-old with student debt is less likely to own a car than a person without student debt. And I would like to hear from you explain what the long-term economic impact would be on the economy for middle-class students and parents as we continue to spend this share of our money putting students in debt. If we took if the feds bought all the loans from the private banks at 50 cents on the dollar and let the students renegotiate down to 1% above prime, like we do on our house. Everyone here has renegotiated a house mortgage, but a kid can't renegotiate their loan rate. If we did some things like that, tell me what that would do to the country if we freed up the debt load on the young people of this country.
Well, Congressman, we've not looked into that as carefully as we would to really answer your question. I think you're certainly right that for some people, the debts they accumulate in college or in graduate school really hamper their ability to move on in their lives in an economic sense. And that could have lasting negative effects on the economy. How important this is for student loans for the economy as a whole, I think is not clear yet to analysts. And even looking at the sort of careful comparison of people with and without student loans that you're describing, these people can differ in other ways as well. So one needs really to isolate the causal effect of the student loans. One really needs to do some very complicated research. And people are doing that kind of work, and we will try to draw on it. But at this, and we mentioned in our report now that one of the factors that may be holding down the rate of household formation over the last few years is student loans. But we put it in a kind of speculative way in the report because I think we're not sure.
I think the real estate industry would agree with you. I've talked to a number of people who are 40 years old and still paying debt and having trouble buying their houses because of the fact they have this overhang of debt which goes on endlessly. It seems to me that the reducing it to 1% above prime for student loans would be, only people who would be affected would be the banks by that. Everybody else would be better off.
Gentleman's time has expired.
We'd have to see more of the details of that proposal, Congressman.
Gentleman, Indiana, Mr. Stutzman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Dr. Elmendorf. It's good to be back on the Budget Committee, and I have enjoyed the conversation this morning tremendously. And, one of the things that I want to talk about is what Ranking Member Van Hollen mentioned, and Dr. Elmendorf, you mentioned it as well, about wage stagnation. I tell you, folks across the country are not seeing an increase in wages. And I don't think that they're blaming their employers. They're not blaming themselves. they're looking at Washington, D.C. and saying, when are we going to get a break? I mean, one of the things that just amazes me is, we look at your analysis here, and the chairman mentioned our problem is spending, but all people across the country here are more taxes. The president just rolled out this free community college program, but in order to fund the program, he's going to propose taxing 529 college savings plans. I mean, that's as middle class as it gets right there. Could you give me just a quick answer? If there was a tax on 529 college plans, would that discourage more savings from middle income, anybody, from saving money towards education?
Well, Congressman, as I said earlier, we have not analyzed the president's proposals yet. We will do that with our colleagues and the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation when the president's budget arises. My understanding is that a great deal of the tax savings associated with 529 plans goes to people who are fairly far up in the income distribution.
But I would say this, that when people start to see that gas prices are lower, they get to keep more money in their pocket. When they see that more dollars are going to be taken out of their 529 plan, they're going to think twice about where do they put their money. I mean, the American people are smart people with their money, but it continues to, we just continue to see Washington take more and more of it, and that's why they're frustrated with the fact that the economy is not growing for them. And it's because of Washington, D.C., whether it's the gas tax, whether it's raising the cap on Social Security, 529 plan, there's always another tax just around the corner that is standing in front of the American people. I want to touch on the interest on our debt. Over the next 10 years, you projected that interest on the national debt will nearly quadruple to $827 billion. If I could get the chart put up on the screen regarding the breakdown of the budget. Of course, the blue, many of us have seen this chart. The blue points out our discretionary spending that we fight over every year, and the red is the autopilot spending. Now, I argue that we put it on autopilot, but Congress can still change the red spending. Is that correct, Dr. Elmendorf?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we look at Social Security. We've discussed that. Of course, you have Medicare and Medicaid and other mandatory, which continues to grow. But interest at $229 billion right now, and over 10 years, it'll nearly quadruple to $827 billion under the assumption that interest rates are normal. Is that correct?
Under our projection, interest rates will rise a good deal from where they are now, but remain below their average over the 1990s and early 2000s.
What happens if it's a percent higher than what we anticipate? What would it do to this chart?
If interest rates were higher, then interest payments would naturally rise, and if they were lower, interest payments would be lower.
And that's something that we can't control. Is that correct? I mean, we can control just about everything else on this chart, but we can't control.
I think you can't control it when you get to the year in question. Obviously, as you know, you influence it by the deficits that we run between. The interest that is paid in 2025 will depend on the deficits that are run between now and 2025. But when you get to 2025, then unless one wanted to default on the debt, which would be a very dangerous tactic, then yes. Then
okay, so again, here the American people are watching us as we craft a budget for our federal government, and they're going to see all of the spending that we are currently projecting and planning on, and then interest rates on top of that are going to, they're going to increase the federal budget spending, not by their choice, but by the choice of Washington, D.C. not getting spending under control. And that's they're going to have to pay for that. And there's going to be another tax, indirect tax on the American people because we can't get spending under control. Final question, I got 26 seconds. The CBO report notes that GDP growth over the next 10 years will average 2.3%, this being lower than the 50-year historical average rate of 3.3%. What two changes to fiscal policy would make a big difference in moving this up?
There are a lot of possible changes, Congressman. That's a very big question for 7 seconds. The changes that will take place under current law between now and 2025 that we've mentioned are this real bracket creep in the income tax and the effects of the Affordable Care Act. There's a whole collection of changes in fiscal policy involving changes in taxes, changes in government investments, that can affect economic growth.
Would you say tax code and Obamacare are the two biggest?
I
think there are multiple factors.
Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Dr. Elmendorf, and thank you and to everyone at CPO for the work that you do.
Thank you,
Help
Councilman.
us, give us a little guidance on how we make decisions involving the budget and appropriations. And I have to say, after living through the worst economic crisis of our lifetimes, it is a bit heartening to get your economic outlook and budget outlook. It's not all rosy. We have our challenges, but to think back just in the last year, total job growth was the strongest since 1999. 11.2 million private sector jobs were created. That was 58 straight months of private sector job growth. The unemployment rate now is finally down at the lowest. It fell at the fastest pace in 3 decades. Your own report, the first line is the federal budget deficit has fallen sharply in the past few years. In health care, we're seeing some relief. Employer health insurance premiums grew at a rate tied for the lowest on record, lowest health care price inflation in nearly half a century. And then who would have thought we'd be paying under $2 for a gallon of gas? That's pretty remarkable, and that will be a significant boost to families all across the country. And if you're fortunate enough to have money in the stock market over the past decade, you've done pretty well. But here are the challenges. Even though you say the economy will grow at a solid pace over the next few years, we've got to do better at boosting wages for families across the country. And then we have this major demographic problem. It's not something caused by any of us here in Washington. It's just the way it is with the baby boom population. But it often seems like the prescription coming out of Washington and the Budget Committee and appropriations is to tackle just what Mr. Stutzman said, go after that discretionary spending that was a small piece of the pie. And these are the investments that help create jobs and lower the deficit, right? If we have more people working on infrastructure projects across America, what's the economic impact?
Holding everything else equal, if there were just more federal investments and no larger deficits or other factors, then that would be a good thing for the economy.
And the same holds true generally for education investments, veterans health care, medical research would be one.
Certainly for education. Healthcare is more complicated. Of course, there are many government investments that could be good for the American people that wouldn't necessarily raise GDP. So if we were healthier with the same incomes, GDP wouldn't be bigger, we'd be a better society. So government investments can pay off along multiple dimensions. The ones that we would confine ourselves to would be the economic effects.
And these kind of government investments often boost private sector jobs. Say for infrastructure again, if we actually have a good infrastructure bill, then most of the firms across the country will be engineering construction firms that would benefit.
Yes, Congresswoman.
So here's the dilemma. We've seen budgets over the past few years, and I hope we can get out of this, that focus on these very small fights over how do we cut discretionary spending. Infrastructure, medical research, education, these are the job creators. Meanwhile, people say, really don't tackle the demographic challenges. And that, of course, the popular one was, let's privatize Medicare, turn it into a voucher. Boy, that would save us a lot of money, but that's not realistic. We're not going to privatize Medicare, I would hope. That's not going to be part of the budget solution, because that doesn't really save money. It just shifts money to older Americans. So give us a little tutorial on the mandatory side versus discretionary side. How do they compare in the long-term debt? What's the challenge there?
Well, certainly, Congresswoman, the growth in federal spending is on the mandatory side, not the discretionary side. And even within the mandatory category, it is really focused on the programs that provide benefits to older Americans and that provide health care benefits, in some cases both. So it's Social Security and Medicare. If you look out to 2025, if you take Social Security spending alone will be 1/4 of total federal spending, according to our projections. Other big pieces are for Medicare, for interest on the debt, for defense spending. You take just those 4 pieces, Social Security, Medicare, interest on the debt, and defense spending, those together would represent 2/3 of total federal spending in 2025 under our projections. And that's really unprecedented in our history. But at the same time, there is this marked reduction relative to the size of the economy in a way we have not seen over at least the last half century in federal spending of this discretionary sort, the sort that the Congress sets appropriations for each year.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bratt, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Doctor, for being with us today.
Congressman.
You want to turn on your mic, please?
Oh, sorry. How do you turn this?
Got to hold the green button, you hold it down.
How's that?
It's good.
Good, thank you very much. Hey, I just want to go over some terminology I think might be helpful and point to potential solutions versus non-solutions. We've been talking a little bit about GDP growth, and in Econ 101, usually the gold standard is GDP per capita growth, and that kind of measures personal welfare. So we had a question earlier about immigration, and you scored some immigration plan that would increase GDP by 5.4%. Is that correct?
Yes, Congressman.
And so if you invited the whole world to the United States and increased our population in the U.S. by 7 billion people, would that necessarily increase GDP significantly as well?
That would increase GDP, yes.
Good. And so,
But not necessarily GDP per capita.
good.
And we reported that. In our analysis of the immigration legislation, we looked at GDP and GNP,
Good.
both in total and on a per capita basis.
Right, and I appreciate it. I just want to get at right. So if you did invite 7 trillion folks here, most likely what would happen to GDP growth per capita? And especially after taxes and transfers.
Well, your experience is a little hard for me to get my mind around,
Yeah.
but certainly in the case of the Senate's immigration legislation, we thought that we focused on a real GNP to capture the effect on income.
Yep.
We thought that real GNP per capita would be lower at the end of the first decade, but higher at the end of the second decade because of the legislation. And that's basically because over time we think the extra workers would stimulate more capital investment.
Good. And let me put you on the spot too. Just if we say GDP grows by 5.4%, is that good, bad, or are you guys neutral on that one?
Well, I mean, all else equal, people generally think that more GDP is good, but all else isn't always equal, and that's
Okay.
why we wouldn't endorse particular policies.
Good. I just wanted to get at, because the objectivity of language matters. I'm going to ask you a couple other questions on this. So let's get to the causes of growth. In the growth literature, usually there's the big three: capital stocks, human capital, and innovation, R&D, and et cetera. Capital stocks, the U.S. capital stock has been flat for about 30 years. China's is off the roof if you go out to, off the charts if you go out to Fred or whatever. First of all, do you buy that those are, by large, in the literature, the primary drivers of economic growth, GDP per capita, GDP?
Yes, Congressman.
In the literature.
Yes.
And so capital is hurting. I appreciate your comments on the effects of world trade on our middle-class wages. I think that's true and on the spot. So let's go to the second driver of GDP growth. That's human capital. I taught college for 18 years or whatever. I've been seeing students come. Math and science test scores used to lead the world. Now for the OECD countries, we're below the median scores and heading to the bottom. Is it safe to say that that's a good proxy for human capital and that we should expect, if that continues to be the case, lower GDP growth in this country?
I think that certainly is worrisome, Congressman. Yes, absolutely.
And is it also fair to say if we did improve math and science scores and all that they stand for, human knowledge, in our K-12 kids and higher ed, that we could clearly outpace and outcompete the rest of the world as we always did previously?
If we could improve the quality of our human capital, again, all else equal,
Yep.
that could be a hugely beneficial thing for our output growth. We wrote a report last year on federal policies to spur innovation.
Yep.
And we looked at tax policies, we looked at policies involving investment in human capital and so on. We'll make sure to send you a copy of that, Congressman.
Right, good, thank you. On the smaller deficits, that language is true, but if I tell my college kids that the deficit's only $460 billion, and so they're going to have to pay the normal bills that any cohort would have to pay, and on top of that, we're racking up 18 trillion, and the charts up there are worse. Do we have a way of capturing the intergenerational pain we're inflicting on that next generation?
We have done a little work on that topic, Congressman, and we have more underway. I think it's a very important subject for us to try to inform you and your colleagues better about. We did a report a few years ago, for example, on the cost of waiting to address the budget imbalance
good.
and the relative costs of different ways of addressing the budget imbalance on people born in different birth cohorts. And naturally, the longer one waits, the more of that fiscal burden is put on later generations. Of course, at the same time, there's an underlying trend increase in living standards in this country and in most countries. So the future generations will be, all else equal, better off because they will have higher market incomes, and that wants to be balanced with the other factors.
Get my last one, and there's a book called This Time is Different a few years ago that came out after the financial crisis. It's the only data set that was out there on global financial crises over time. In that book, everyone started looking at dashboards and red lights blinking. If the debt, as a ratio of debt to GDP, once again gets up there at the end of 2025, would you be willing to go on record saying that risk level puts us in a very precarious situation in our financial
Time has
system?
expired.
Just 5 seconds. We've written, Congressman, that we think risk rises as the debt to GDP ratio rises, but we've also written that we do not think there's a tipping point that we or anyone else could reliably identify in our relationship.
Time has expired. The gentlelady
Thank you
from
very much.
Michigan, Ms. Dingle, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Am I on? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, I know you just have to enjoy being with all of us.
Actually, I do, Congresswoman.
Questions. But it is an honor to be here with you. I would not call this light bedtime reading last night. I wish I'd gone to bed at the beginning of the report when things looked rosy and didn't look down the road. And I love listening to my colleague.
Most people go to bed during reading the report, Congresswoman.
I stayed awake, unfortunately, and then I didn't sleep. Because we've got to figure it out, and we've got a lot of tough issues that we really do talk about. Reality isn't going to go away, and I hope we can have some good bipartisan discussions on how we address them. I really would like to talk about the middle class, but since my colleague left off at the debt limit, I would like to ask one question, which would be, what would you think the repercussions would be if the federal government were to default on its loan? And when do you think we're going to have to look at raising the debt ceiling again?
So under current law, the debt ceiling suspension ends in the middle of March, and at that point, the debt ceiling will be set equal to what it was before. The suspension plus any debt issued in the meantime, which is to say that we will immediately be up against the debt limit in the middle of March, unless the law is changed. And again, unless there's something else happens, we think that Treasury will run out of its standard, quote, extraordinary measures by September or October, and shortly after that would run out of cash and would not be able to make meet all of its obligations on a timely basis. The consequences of that to our economy and financial system and to the global economy and financial system could be quite severe, and we have no way of quantifying exactly because we've never let that happen before in this country.
And you would not recommend that we do, correct?
It is a very, very risky, dangerous strategy, Congresswoman.
So we were discussing the middle class, and people have talked about the observations you've made about the 58 consecutive months of private sector job growth with 11 million jobs being added. I'm concerned that that doesn't totally tell us the whole story because the ordinary workers aren't feeling it. You talked a few minutes ago about one of the reasons that we were seeing decreased revenue was corporations, one that we're seeing more jobs shipped overseas, but also, and I don't happen to think that this is a bad thing, that we're going to start to see increased labor costs. I think too many workers have seen their wages have been stagnant over the last 5 years. In fact, I think the real median family income has declined about $5,000. And one recent study showed that from 2009 to 2012, the top 1% salary grew faster than the incomes of the bottom 99%, except for in West Virginia and in many states, including mine of Michigan, the 99% income didn't increase. So my question to you is that would focus on creating new middle-class jobs increase revenues and increase the deficit?
Well, so Congresswoman, on the numbers you cite about incomes, we issue a report ourselves every year on the distribution of household income and federal taxes. The latest report we have actually goes through 2011. We operate with some lag as we wait for the detailed tax data to be available. The precise numbers for shares of income and for income growth in different parts of the distribution do depend on a number of technical features, but I think every data source that I'm aware of shows much greater income growth at the top of the distribution than further down the distribution. If more middle-class jobs could be created, the effects on the budget, I think, would really depend on the mechanism through which they were created and the budgetary cost of that, and also what those people would have been doing otherwise. So if those people would have otherwise been in lower-paying jobs, then giving them higher-paying jobs in which they are more productive, and thus they earn higher wages, that, all else equal, would be good for GDP, and it would be good for the federal budget. But it does depend on if there are federal policies you have in mind. Of course, the net effect would depend on the cost of those policies.
Well, let me ask you this question. It would seem to me that making smart, targeted investments in education, infrastructure, and research and development, as my colleagues have talked about, would be a good thing. Do you have recommendations on how the federal government should invest to create more middle-class jobs and increase revenue?
So we don't make recommendations. We have looked at different reports on a number of different approaches that the Congress could take, including federal investments. And when we model the macroeconomic effects of changes in fiscal policies, one of the channels that we capture is the effects of changes in federal investments, in physical infrastructure, in education and training, and in research and development. So we think those kinds of investments do pay a return that will turn up in GDP and in people's wages and ultimately in federal revenues.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Blum, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, for being here. Thoroughly enjoy listening to your insight.
Thank you,
to our
Congressman.
budget challenges that we have. I happen to be seated next to a PhD in economics today, and I'm asking questions to a PhD in economics. I'm just a simple, small businessman, so I'm going to try to simplify this a bit. The solutions, Doctor, that we often hear to balance our budget are to raise revenues, cut spending, or a combination of the both. And I'd like to focus my questioning on the revenue side of that equation. And when we look at revenues, I assume we can either raise tax rates or we can increase the number of taxpayers and their incomes, or a combination of both. Would you agree with that?
That's right. There's another another possibility, which is to broaden the tax base so that, for example, one could reduce the number of deductions or exclusions so that the existing income of existing people, a large amount would be taxed, and thus a lower tax rate could yield the same or more revenue.
The number of taxpayers, correct. CBO, I believe, has recently revised downward GDP growth through 2018 to 2.5%. Is that correct?
Yes.
The fact of the matter is, Doctor, that this economic recovery, I believe, is the worst economic recovery in United States history post-World War II. Is that correct as well?
I don't know individual previous recoveries, Congressman, but this recovery is certainly much weaker than the average of the last half dozen or so recoveries.
And I know we touched on this earlier, but just by way of comparison, in the 80s, the Reagan recovery produced economic GDP growth of 3.5% a year, and your revised projections are 2.5% through 2018. I assume we would all agree that an additional 1% of GDP growth would result in more revenues to the federal government.
That's right, Congressman. But again, there are many factors that affect GDP growth, and the principal difference between the economy we face today and the one of 20 or 30 years ago in terms of GDP growth is a different demographic situation. The baby boomers are now retiring, and women's labor force participation has roughly leveled off after a number of decades of strong increases. So the principal factor behind the slower growth over the coming decade relative to the past few decades is these changes in demographics. That doesn't, I don't want to minimize the role that federal policies can play. They play some role in our baseline, and different policies can also matter. But the biggest difference in the trend growth rate we see going ahead and the trend growth rate of previous decades is being in a different place in our demographics.
The old saying is genius is the ability to reduce the complicated to the simple. And once again, I did a little research on the 80s and that recovery, and there was more wealth creation and there's more prosperity created for the average person in this country than at any time in the history of this planet. And some of the reasons were President Reagan reduced the regulatory burden on businesses. He reduced the burden of taxation on both businesses and consumers, and he implemented a strong dollar policy. Can you comment on each one of those three, Doctor, and what kind of an impact they would have to the revenues of our federal budget through increased economic activity, increased GDP growth?
So we've not studied the recovery of the 1980s ourselves. I know people have. I think that, and there is disagreement in the profession about what played more or less important roles in the recovery of the 1980s. In addition to the difference in demographics that I highlighted, fiscal policy was different in the early 1980s than it's been in the last several years, because the last several years deficits have been reduced very sharply in a way that's created a drag on the economy. Monetary policy has been different because the Federal Reserve could cut rates a lot in the early 1980s because they were quite high to start with going into that deep recession, and they have been stuck by the zero lower bound recently. So there are a lot of policy differences, and the role, the things you highlight, the differences in tax policy and regulatory policy may have mattered as well, but it's not easy, I think, to parse out the contributions of different policies, and we haven't done it. So I can't speak to that comparison, I'm afraid.
And lastly, I'd like to get one more question in. Inflation is one of the great hidden taxes, particularly to people on fixed incomes and our elderly. As of January 21st, there's $2.8 trillion sitting on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, when only $150 billion is required. Much of that is a result of our policy of quantitative easing. What impacts has quantitative easing, the monetization of our debt, had on your inflation projections?
It's had little effect, Congressman. Inflation has been quite low over the past several years, below the Federal Reserve's target. We think that the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing policies have provided some boost to economic activity, and because of that, they've made the unemployment rate a little less than it would otherwise be, and a little lower unemployment rate means a slight bit higher inflation. But again, this is coming from a level of inflation that is below what the Federal Reserve is aiming for.
Gentleman's time is expired.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. Mooney, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, so the budget says just to round off the numbers, we're spending about $3.5 trillion a year, and the revenues coming in is about $3 trillion. So if we were to address this by cutting, what percentage of the $3.5 trillion would we have to cut?
Well, we'd have to cut by about today, we'd have to cut by about a sixth. So if you want spending down from $3.5 trillion to $3 trillion, which is roughly right, then you have to cut by about $500 billion, which is about 1/6 or 15% of the spending.
About 15%, okay. And
difference a little larger as the decade goes on because the gap between outlays and revenues rises over time.
Okay, thank you. And you talked a lot about the effect of tax policies. I'm also concerned about the effect of regulations. For example, the Obama administration proposed a sweeping new ozone standard that could eliminate as many as 14,000 jobs in my state of West Virginia and more across the country. The job loss related to this proposed ozone rule would obviously lead to a decrease in taxable income. Can you describe the tools the CBO has used to measure the budgetary impact of these job losses?
So, Congressman, we don't analyze the effects of specific changes in regulation. We focus on changes in federal taxes and spending. It would be it would be an interesting but very large and complicated exercise for us to do this kind of analysis of the economic effects of specific regulations, and that has not been our mission, and so I'm afraid we don't do that kind of work.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you do this next one either, but with the Keystone Pipeline, we've been debating that. The State Department's estimate that the construction of the Keystone Pipeline would create at least 16,000 jobs. Do you agree with that estimate?
I've seen that work, Congressman, but again, we've not done those estimates ourselves.
Okay. Actually, I have no further questions.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Elmendorf, for coming and spending some time with us. You talked about the rate of growth for Medicare and Medicaid. Let's assume for a moment that the Supreme Court in King v. Burwell agrees with King and prohibits the federal subsidies outside of the state exchanges, and further that all or majority of the states refuse to establish these exchanges. What would be the long-term projections for Medicare and Medicaid under this scenario?
I really don't know, Congressman. Our projection, as you understand, incorporates what is happening under the implementation today of the Affordable Care Act, in which subsidies are available through exchanges that are not just those run by states. But if the Supreme Court were to stop that practice, that could have a significant effect on our projections. But the effect it would have would depend on the nature of the Supreme Court's actual ruling. And we discovered a few years ago in trying to help members of Congress anticipate what the effects of that Supreme Court ruling would be, that we weren't very good at predicting Supreme Court rulings, and that the details matter a lot. So we have no ability now to say exactly what would happen if the Supreme Court changes the implementation of current law, because it would just depend so much on exactly what they would say.
So, in looking forward, Congress is going to have to, we're not going to wait until the court rules to decide what we're going to do. So I want to be clear, are you saying that you have no idea or no ability to project what the long-term impact on Medicare and Medicaid might be if the court were to rule in favor of King?
I just don't want to speculate, Congressman, because it depends very much on the precise nature of that ruling. And then once they rule, and then if there is a change relative to what is happening, relative to the current implementation, then we will produce new projections at that point. That may take us some time. It took us some time when the Supreme Court ruled a few years ago to take on board the specific nature of their ruling.
Okay, let's move to another topic on energy. I noted in your opening statement that the economy, one of the things that's helped the economy improve is the lower energy cost. And there appears to be a clear indication that the development of energy resources would create a boost to the economy. It certainly has currently. Does your current outlook take into consideration the exploration and access to the vast energy resources located on federal lands that are currently not being utilized?
So our economic projections certainly are designed to be consistent with current federal policies. But there isn't a special setting in the model, essentially, for every individual piece of federal policies. We did a related analysis published a couple months ago on the effects of fracking on the U.S. economy, and we think that the development of shale resources is mattering in a noticeable way. But for most individual pieces of regulation, we don't do a separate analysis of those economic effects for our baseline projections.
Let me be a little more specific. I think we've only explored 15% of the outer continental shelf. We have some idea of what resources are available. I know within the continental United States, the Green River Formation, for instance, is projected to hold about 3 trillion barrels of recoverable oil. I would be interested to know, and I think many members would be interested to know what the revenue based on federal royalties might be generated, what kind of revenues would be generated, and have some idea of how it would impact the economy.
So, yeah, Congressman, we did a report a couple of years ago where we looked at the sort of question you're raising and the effects on the federal budget of different policies regarding resources in Alaska and also elsewhere. And we can get you a copy of that report right away, and then we're happy to talk with you about any questions you have about it.
One last thing I'd like to know is there's some information out there that indicates that private property owners are paid a higher royalty rate than the federal government gets paid. I'd like to look into that. One last question.
Some of the money goes to states, Congressman. Part of the reason the federal government collects less money than the people who acquire this property pay is the state governments receive part of it under current law.
Being a Gulf state, I'm aware of that. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the rest of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Sanford, is recognized for 5 minutes.
My light doesn't seem to, oh, it's on now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pile of questions in only 5 minutes, so I'm going to try and run through at least a couple of them. First off is, I'm still trying to get my arms around this deficit thing, which has been referenced a couple points throughout the conversation. And I guess the simplest way to put it is, back home, if a family makes $100 and they spend 120, they got a deficit of 20. Vice versa, if they made $100 and they spent 80, they got a surplus of 20, right?
Yes.
So in that regard, is the American public being lied to or just misled with regard to this notion of deficits coming down? And I say that because of this. I actually pulled the numbers. The official deficit of last year was $483 billion.
Yes.
But the debt went up by $1.086 trillion, which is to say there's a difference there of about $600 billion. So when people read in the papers, which they've been reading about, the number coming down, but in fact, the debt goes up by about $1 trillion, it doesn't seem to me like the deficit's really coming down. Actually, I had the office pull the numbers over the last 12 years, and on average, there's been about a $279 billion delta per year over the last 12 years on the difference between deficit and, again, debt going up.
So I think there are two factors here, Congressman. One is I believe you're referring to gross federal debt, which includes the holdings of debt, Treasury debt, by certain funds that are also under the control of the federal government. And the measure of debt that we focus on, and I used in my remarks explicitly, was federal debt held by the public, which we think is the better measure.
The number that really matters, that ultimately drives the interest rate on which your long-term assumptions are built,
is federal debt held by the public. It is not the gross debt. It is the debt held by the public. It is the federal government's net transactions.
Wait. You're saying government borrowing from government doesn't matter in impacting interest rates over the long run?
That's right, Congressman. What matters is the federal government's borrowing of funds from the private sector. And so we look at, in our interest rate projections, we look at the amount the
if that was the case,
already borrowed
then
from
why
public
not
and
just
will
borrow entirely from other governmental agencies?
Well, Congressman, what we look at is we look at the unified federal budget. So we take all of the pieces of the budget, and this was a concept that was really put in place in the late 1960s, before the foundation of CBO. We focus on the unified budget. So we take all the activities of the government together. And that means that financial transactions within pieces of the government, although we certainly track them and report them in our reports because they are set in place in some cases to be control mechanisms for you, but in terms of the effects of the government and the overall economy, what matters is how the unified government interacts with the private economy.
I understand.
And debt held by the public is the measure.
I would go back, and I only got 2 minutes. It seems to me that the ultimate driver would be aggregate debt in impacting interest rates over the long run, and I think there's a fair amount of history on the economic front that supports that. Secondly, I would say, which is to say, I think that the long-term interest rates numbers are low, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. I also want to take exception, though. You responded to my colleague, Congressman Rokita, with his question, well, you could do revenue or you could do expenses, either one. Your point was either one entirely. I don't think that that's plausible. I mean, the Laffer curve in its entirety is built on the notion of there being a point beyond which you can only squeeze but so much blood from a turnip. If you look at the last 50 years, we've been around 20% fairly consistently. The long-term numbers based on spending are going to take us up 30, 35% of GDP. I don't know how you squeeze that much blood from a turnip based on 50-year numbers that we have historically here in this country.
So, Congressman, if the increase in outlays that we project was met by an increase in revenues of that amount, then revenues would no doubt be a larger share of GDP in this country than they have been historically in this country. But there are other countries that have revenues as a larger share of GDP, and they're making a choice to have more public resources and fewer private resources, and that's a choice that we could make. We don't.
Well,
not our
no,
place to
but
recommend
that is
for or
to say
against
that
it, but
there aren't cultural
choice.
differences between civilizations, and I would argue
Just
that
saying,
there are.
as an economic matter, that choice is a choice that the country could make.
So it's premised on a change of mindset within the American psyche that's been in existence for about 50 years, is the choice that you're suggesting could be made.
Well, I think the challenge that you and your colleagues face and that the American people face is that there's a set of benefit programs to which people have become accustomed that are becoming much more expensive because of the aging of the population and rising costs of health care.
So many questions.
So they will need to, we as a people will need to do something very differently than we have become used to on the budget, either revenues or spending programs.
One quick 6 seconds. Erskine Bowles, who was former chief of staff to President Clinton, said that we are looking at the most predictable economic crisis in history. I think it's absolutely clear that the fiscal path we're on is not sustainable, and that the best analogy would be a cancer. Him, again, pointing to this notion of deficits. But I see I've run out of time. A lot of good questions I'm going to go into, Mr. Chairman. All right.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During the 2008 to 2010 fiscal year, the Department of Labor Affordable Care Act's last open enrollment period, Dr. Elmendorf, more than 8 million Americans enrolled in private coverage, and 6 million of them have received tax credits to offset the cost of their premiums. An additional 6 million have enrolled in Medicaid or the Children's Health Insurance Program. We've seen the United States' uninsured rate continue to decline, reaching a low of 13.4%. Some of my colleagues refuse to acknowledge any benefits that come from the ACA. That's my editorializing, of course, but I haven't found any. They've done nothing but attempt to repeal it time and time again. Now, Mr. Elmendorf, according to the CBO's long-term outlook, and I'm glad we questioned today what does long-term mean and how long can we project without stumbling over our own 2 feet. What impact will the Affordable Care Act have on the number of uninsured over the next 10 years? Do you have those numbers?
I do, Congressman. We think that the Affordable Care Act will reduce the number of Americans without health insurance by around 25 million people in each year from 2016 on through the rest of the decade.
So the next 10 years, we should see a drop. We should have about 26, 27 million people who will be covered under this act.
26 to 27 million fewer people will be uninsured, will end up with health insurance because of the Affordable Care Act, is our projection, Congressman, yes.
That's a big number. I think everybody would have to agree. So we have to make adjustments here, like every other law that we have ever passed, like Social Security, like Medicare, like Medicaid. And if we repeal this, if we do away with it tomorrow morning or on April the 15th or on July 1st, whenever they get around to it, possibly doing that, we're talking about not only those folks that are in it now, but those people who are projected who do not have insurance now that will not be getting insurance in the future. Okay.
Yes, Congressman.
My second question is this. We also heard that we're going to have a shift to part-time employment because of the Affordable Care Act. You've heard this before. In fact, we had legislation. One of the first bills we passed, Mr. Chairman, that we voted on in this new Congress, raised the threshold, would have raised the threshold from 30 to 40 hours to address this supposed problem. I want to know this, Dr. Elmendorf. Have we increased part-time employment because of the ACA? Let's look at the real numbers.
Congressman, I don't know whether the ACA has raised part-time employment. Part-time employment rose during the recession. Not surprisingly, it is coming down slowly. We have not separated out the effects of the possible effects of the Affordable Care Act from all the other forces that affect part-time employment.
So from 2008 to 2010, those 3 years, part-time employment was reduced, like every other employment.
So again, I don't have all the facts at hand, Congressman, but there has been, in the recession, there are big swings in these numbers, and that's why I'm saying it's difficult to separate out the effects of particular policies from this recovery or, in fact, from previous recoveries.
I've looked at as much data as I can, and maybe you could steer me in the right direction. I can find no compelling evidence that that's the case, and yet you saw the big deal that was made. I want to ask one quick question before we conclude today, and that is, we're struggling, both sides are struggling with stagnant wages for the average individual. If we have increased profits over the past 3-4 years, and that hasn't increased, that hasn't helped us increase those average wages, what will?
Well, Congressman, that's a hard question. I understand it's a very, very important question, but it's a very hard question. I don't have an answer really up to the measure of the question, I'm afraid. The rising, the falling share of national income going to workers has held down the wages of the average worker, and so has the widening distribution of wages, again, holding all else equal, has been part of the slow growth in wages for the average worker. And the slow growth of GDP has been part of the holding down wages for the average worker. There are a lot of contributing factors, and probably a whole collection of policy responses would be needed. We've looked at a number of them. We've looked at a report a few years ago at policies that would try to help reduce high unemployment or bring people back into the labor force, and we're happy to talk with you about that. I mentioned work we've done on federal investments, and we do work on the effects of changes in tax policy on output and employment, and we're happy to pursue those with you.
Appreciate your efforts.
Thank you. The other gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to start on an area I wasn't going to. I'm going to follow up on the gentleman from Virginia who's talking about the education level and the 3 types of capital, and one of them being human capital. I'm just very curious. I thought he was going to finish up going down this road here. When you make your projections as far as the benefit to GDP, as far as under the plans and a plan, as far as the influx of population, is that considering as well the other factor he pointed out as far as the declining relative position of the U.S. as far as educational standards as far as our capital?
So, Congressman, in our baseline economic projections, we take on board what we think is happening to the labor quality in the United States. We think labor quality is continuing to grow, but not as rapidly as it has in some previous periods.
Right. So in other words, and so it's growing, but relative to the rest of the world, it is declining. And so I guess I assume the gentleman was going to follow up by saying something effective, if we increase that number to a relatively larger extent, our position vis-a-vis the world will be at a continuous decline unless we make some sort of other substantial reversal in that educational platform.
I think that's right. Of course, many factors affect the economic outcomes in different countries, but just for that factor alone, yes, if we could do a more effective job of educating ourselves, that would help.
So all other things being equal, which is one of your expressions, all other things being equal, since we are not making those substantive changes, all things others being equal, if you make that assumption of an increase in the immigration level, you will see a decrease in our human capital relative to the rest of the world, and a decrease in our human capital to the rest of the world would translate to a relative GDP decrease relative to the rest of the world as well.
Yes.
I thought that's where he was going to, but I'm glad I was able to go the other way. With regard to the debt, your office projects that the debt held by the public will reach 79% by 2025. You all agree this is unsustainable. And in fact, you said in your report, such high and rising debt would have serious negative consequences, and I can ask you what some of them would be. But you state in the report, federal spending on interest payments will rise considerably, an increase in borrowing will increase the demands on funds, which will release reduction in lending to businesses, which is bad for GDP, restrict policymakers' ability to use tax and spend policies for future unexpected challenges, also bad for Congress, lead investors to doubt the government's willingness to pay or the ability to pay, all those things being bad, right?
Yes.
Now, when you get these numbers, I'm wondering what you consider. I'm going to give you 3 or 4 factors. I assume I know the answer to these. So when you come up with this projection, does the CBO take into account the potential for breaking of future spending caps under the Budget Control Act? I assume the answer is
no.
No.
And follow current law.
Right. Does the CBO take into account the potential for, or the actual future wars or military expenditures other than what we have in right now?
We take the appropriations for overseas contingency operations that the Congress has made for this fiscal year, and we extrapolate them with adjustments for inflation without making any strategic assessments.
Of another war or emergency. Does the CBO take into account the potential for another deep recession like we just are in or getting out of?
We allow in the second half of the decade for an average shortfall of GDP relative to potential GDP that corresponds to the historical average, taking account of periods of recession and periods of booms.
But not like we just went through.
We don't put a particular large recession in there, no.
Right. Do you take into account the establishment of new large programs or expenditures that Congress may think of tomorrow?
No, Congressman.
No. So do you take into account the potential for higher than expected interest rates? I know you take into account for expected interest rates.
Right, nor do we take into account the possibility of lower than expected interest rates. So right now, financial markets are actually signaling lower interest rates in the future than we have in this projection. So there are risks on both sides.
So the projections that you're coming up with 79% of GDP in 2025 is really, in some people's analysis, mine, is somewhat of a favorable or rosy scenario, saying that we're not going to engage in other wars, we're not going to make substantial improvements, in expenditures or what have you in any of these other areas, so on and so forth.
By the same token, we have not incorporated any efforts that your colleagues might make to change policies in ways that would reduce budget deficits.
So
As you understand, we follow the current law as specified in our baseline instructions.
So that's why I would say it's, considering all things other being equal, it's a rosy scenario. The one chart that we have, which is, you know, throw this up, to try to put this in perspective, is what? The net interest on the debt will quadruple from $229 billion to $827 billion by 2025. And it's hard to get your hands around that. So I use this little chart to say, what is $827 billion? This is our current expenditures, right? So if we said how much of our pie would have to go out there, that would be basically wiping out what we spend just about on Social Security, if we were to take out that piece of the pie, or all of our non-discretionary defense, plus all of our Medicaid expenditures. That's really what we're talking about, even under the rosiest of scenarios that CBOs project. Is that correct?
Well, again, I disagree with the rosy. We're following current law, and we're not taking our own assumptions about whether Congress will act to make the deficit larger or will act to make the deficit smaller over the coming decade, and you understand why it would be inappropriate for us to do that. Right. The technical point to just note is that by 2025, when we project interest payments at $827 billion, Social Security will be much larger as well.
Is different. Yeah.
Gentleman's time has expired. Dr. Elmendorf, I want to thank you very much for appearing before us today. I want to please let you know that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing, and those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. We thank everybody for attending, and the committee stands adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.